Hey guys, welcome to the Just DAO It podcast, the podcast for people starting DAOs. Today is a little bit of a different episode in case you haven't already noticed. My name is Leo Henkels, and I'll be your host today. A little bit more about me is that I've been doing business development at MIDAO for a little over a year now, and I also help produce the Just DAO It podcast. So bear with me. Might have some technical issues as we are recording live, but I will edit this live stream and post it to our podcast feed at the end of the day so everyone can listen to it. Before I kind of dive into our topic for today, Adam, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So, regular listeners know me as usually the host of the podcast. Today, I'm the guest, as you can see. But I've been working on MIDAO for about 3 years. Before that, I was consulting for people starting and operating DAOs. And I got into crypto originally in 2012. I've been researching the space since then and eventually got into it professionally to work on DAOs.
Awesome. So yeah, just again, we're recording live, so there may be issues as usual, but I'll try to edit them out in the podcast feed for everybody. So I think we should talk about this episode that we're recording, and I think the main topic that we'll be touching on is the DAO regulation that was recently passed in the Marshall Islands. And I thought there would be we thought that there would be no better people to talk about it than me and Adam, as we worked on implementing these changes and then getting them ready for our clients. So before we kind of dive into the specifics of the DAO regulation and talk about what it means for current and future clients, Adam, do you want to provide a little history about MIDAO, about the Marshall Islands and its relationship with DAOs, so that everyone has the appropriate context before we kind of dive into the regulation?
Yeah, sounds good. So first of all, a little history of the Marshall Islands. So the Marshall Islands became an independent nation around the end of the 1970s after being a German colony, a Japanese colony, and a U.S. colony or territory during World War II. And shortly after gaining its independence, started a shipping registry. And the shipping registry has led the Marshall Islands to become one of the top 3 destinations or jurisdictions for shipping related companies to domicile. So they have about 40 New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ companies that are Marshall Islands companies. So big player in the shipping industry. Fast forwarding to about 3 years ago, I was working on building technology for some DAOs when I realized that a lot of DAOs had a similar problem. And that problem was actually a legal problem, or really a jurisdictional and legal entity problem, which is to say that there was nowhere good to incorporate. Now, this came up because we were offered, the one DAO I was working on was offered $1 million grant from the Moonbeam Ecosystem Fund. And they said to accept this grant, you have to sign the grant agreement, which means you need a legal entity for your DAO. Otherwise, you can't enter into a contract. And so we looked around the world. We looked at Cayman, Swiss, Panama, Delaware, other popular corporate jurisdictions, and came to the realization that all of these options would have forced us to make certain compromises. So, for example, we didn't want to be forced to have a board or any kind of management team for our DAO. We wanted to put power directly in the hands of our members or token holders. Additionally, we wanted to be able to have anonymous membership. So we wanted people to be able to hold our token and be a member of the company. And not to have to know their name and address, right? Because it's not practical when you have so many members who are just holding and trading tokens and stuff like that. And so both of these things were impossible with any legal entity that was available at the time. So we reached out to a senator in the Marshall Islands and started a conversation that led to first some brainstorming and eventually passing the first law in the Marshall Islands in late 2021. Which created a nonprofit DAO LLC, a new type of legal entity that's made for DAOs and Web3. And over the past few years, we've passed 2 additional laws at the end of 2022 and the end of 2023. And then finally, just a couple months ago, passed the DAO regulation, which is what we're here primarily to talk about today, but we're going to put it in the context of the greater story and everything going on in the Marshall Islands. And in that first year, so in 2022, we created MIDAO, which stands for Marshall Islands DAO. MIDAO is a public-private partnership with the government of the Marshall Islands, and it follows the same model that the Marshall Islands has used in the shipping industry very successfully, which is that there's one private company that acts as the sole registered agent of record for all in the case of the shipping industry, for all the shipping related companies. Really, all offshore companies other than DAOs are registered through this one registered agent that's in a partnership with the government. And so MIDAO follows the same model. We are the registered agent for DAO LLCs that want to register in the Marshall Islands. So I think we'll get into a little bit more about our legal entity itself, the DAO LLC, and how it works and its benefits. But that's a little bit of history as far as how we got here. And maybe I'll just add one more thing, which is we're now approaching about 200 DAOs that are registering in the Marshall Islands after just about 2.5 years of this project. So we're seeing some really good growth of DAOs in the Marshall Islands.
Yeah, and I'd also highlight that we have at least 50 clients that are currently interested and have signed on with us. So over 250 clients that we are in talks with total for getting a DAO LLC, which is really exciting. And just one other thing I'd highlight is that if you guys want to dig deeper into the Marshall Islands, or if you want to hear from some of the people in the Marshall Islands government and hear them talk about their thoughts on crypto, there's a great podcast on Balaji Srinivasan's feed, kind of talking about the Marshall Islands and its relationship with crypto. So if you're interested in learning more about that and some of the background there, I'd recommend checking that out. And I'll make sure to link that in the show notes after the live stream. So Adam, I think one thing that I know I always have questions about, and I think other people might, is what is regulation, right? And how is that potentially different than legislation? We touched on the legislation, but why? What is regulation? How is it different from legislation? And then in a Marshall Islands context, how is it different from what we've already, or from what the Marshall Islands has already passed in the legislation?
It's a good question. I would say the simplest answer is just to say that there are kind of a couple layers of rules or policies that guide how a system works in a nation or a state. Laws are probably the base level. You could say the base level is the constitution of the country or the state. The level above that is legislation. Usually legislation has to be passed by the democratically elected governing body of that state. And maybe approved by a president or a governor. And so then that legislation becomes the another base layer. And then regulations are usually passed in a sense on top of the laws, on top of the legislation. And it becomes another set of rules that you have to follow. Usually it goes into a lot more detail. So if a law maybe, goes over the basic core concepts, it's like in the case of a DAO LLC, brings it into existence and defines what it is, right? Mm-hmm. And it does there's a more nuance than that, but then a regulation instead says, okay, well, here's the forms you have to fill out to create one of these DAO LLCs, and here's the process you have to follow. The regulation even goes into what the government has to do and how the government is supposed to operate to facilitate the DAO LLCs in the Marshall Islands. So it's a little bit different probably wherever you look. And Leo, you brought this point up with me earlier too, which is you could also even look at like case law. And, once there's conflicts in the courts, then those decisions that are made by judges, and by the way, this is different in different places, right? We have people could look into the difference between like common law versus non-common law societies. The Marshall Islands follows the same pattern as the United States in terms of how its legal system is structured, except that it's just one country. It's not a country with a bunch of different states that have their own rules, which can really simplify things. But you could look at court cases too, and you could argue that that's kind of another layer even on top of the regulations. So you have these different layers, and you could kind of refer to all of it as policy in a sense, or you could refer to it as a legal framework or a regulatory environment, right? That regulatory environment for DAOs in the Marshall Islands, if I say that, I'm referring to all of it, right? It's everything from the core laws of the Marshall Islands to the DAO law, to the DAO regulation, to eventually there will be court cases too. And people will have to look and see, well, how are the courts acting? And let me consider how that affects, my perception of the policy environment, the legal environment, the regulatory environment.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Hopefully it helps clear things up for other people besides me, because when I'm talking to DAOs every day as part of my job here at MIDAO, they're always telling me about how there's regulation in the US, and then there's legislation based in other jurisdictions, and then there's all different types of crypto things being passed, and they're not sure what to follow. And I think that's the reality, is that crypto regulation legislation is pretty ambiguous and pretty confusing worldwide. And something that we're trying to do at the Marshall Islands is simplify it and give DAOs really just one way to follow, so they don't have to pull in from different jurisdictions to try to figure out what to do as a global organization. And I think we talked. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it's worth mentioning that, the reality is that unfortunately, if you're a global project, a global organization, you do have to take into account laws all over the world.
Right.
For example, wherever you hire someone, usually it doesn't matter what your home jurisdiction is. They may have rules you have to follow, but you have to follow the rules, the policies where you're hiring the person. Let's say you're raising money from an investor. You have to follow the rules where that person is located and where their transaction takes place, not just where your home jurisdiction is. So there are certain core things that depend primarily on your chosen jurisdiction, especially the structure of your legal entity. So like, how do you track your members? How do you make decisions? Are you required to have a board or officers or other things? And we'll get into some of the unique elements of the Marshall Islands DAO LLC legal entity. But there are all kinds of rules that you do have to follow. Let's say you're holding an event in Switzerland. There might be Swiss laws that apply to holding events there. It doesn't matter if you're a Marshall Islands company or a Delaware company in that regard. So you do, I'd say, I don't know if it's fair to say unfortunately, I guess just because it can be challenging and costly, we say unfortunately, but that's the nature of the world that we live in, is that if you're operating globally, you do have to take global rules into account, but it's also important to pick the right home jurisdiction to domicile your company.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah, I think that clears things up. Awesome. So you want to kind of zoom in into like the regulation itself and how that might change some of our current processes. I think probably the most applicable way is, how is it changing our processes for future customers? And I think the most common question that we get are questions around the registration process. So you kind of want to dive in how the regulation is changing things there?
I mean, yeah, first of all, one of the goals for the regulation is to be a plain English document that anyone can read. Now, admittedly, as I paged through it, it is 19 pages long. Now, several of those pages are forms. And that's one of the nice things about the regulation, is that you can go and see what are the forms you're going to have to fill out when you're applying for a DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands. It does look a lot like a law, there's a lot in there, but it's generally speaking meant to be the document that tells you, as someone thinking about setting up a DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands, what you have to do, what the requirements are. So you're going to find in there very clear-cut definitions of things like, what is a beneficial owner? Who has to do KYC? So, one of the benefits of DAO LLCs in the Marshall Islands is that you have relatively limited KYC requirements. The nice thing about doing everything on chain, if you are a DAO that does everything on chain, is that all that information is publicly available. So MIDAO and the government and law enforcement can verify that you're not doing anything untoward. So they don't necessarily need to know who all of your members are. They can look on chain and make sure that you're not, engaging in any criminal activity. And so most of the members of a DAO LLC can be anonymous. But if you want to know who does have to do KYC, and I'll tell you in a second, it's pretty straightforward, then you can find that in the regulation. And basically what we're talking about is any beneficial owners, which is defined as anyone with 25% or more governance rights, of voting rights in the company. By the way, I always say company because that's the legal term for what you're turning your DAO into, in a sense, right? Or leveraging as part of your DAO's ecosystem, is you're creating a company. And that's the term that applies to all different types of companies, whether it's corporations, whether it's foundations, whether it's LLCs and DAO LLCs. So I'll say company. I know a lot of DAOs think of themselves as something different, and that's fine, right? Just because you're a company doesn't mean you have to act like other companies do. But anyways, when you're forming the company, you need anyone who has 25% or more voting rights, which is frankly, often no one, right? If you're already a DAO at some scale, you may have no one who has 25% or more voting rights. If there's no beneficial owners in that regard, then all managing members have to do KYC. Now, you don't have to have managing members. So managing members are kind of the equivalent of a board or officers or directors, but for an LLC. And in the case of the DAO LLC in the Marshall Islands, you don't have to have managing members. But if you do, they're next in line to have to perform KYC as the people who generally have the most control over the organization. If there's no managing members either, then we default to one person from the DAO. Any one person has to do KYC. And so a lot of our DAOs have one person who has to do KYC, whether it's the only beneficial owner, or maybe at the time of founding, there's only one member, and then you're going to launch the DAO, launch a token, and that person has to do KYC. For many of our clients, it's just one person, but at the most, it's those beneficial owners and or managing members. So that's one thing that's just a lot more clear now. You can find it in the regulation. That it's going to be enforced consistently because it's written into the regulation and into the forms in the regulation. Another example of what's in the regulation. So we've created a concept. So one of the challenges with DAOs, as people listening to this probably know, is that sometimes it's hard to know who to talk to at a DAO, right? Let's say you're going to a DAO and you're trying to ask them a question about their DAO. Hey, what's the answer to this? How does this operate? Sometimes it's tough because these DAOs can operate in new ways that are much more decentralized in their social, political, kind of corporate structure, such that there's no one necessarily in charge of the question that you're asking. Or no one in charge of external relations or communications or whatever it is. So we at MIDAO and the government needs to know that there's someone at the DAO we can talk to about official matters, right? Let's say your DAO gets sued. Let's say your annual filings are overdue and you're at risk of facing a fee, right? Like we need to know who to contact to inform about these important matters. So we've introduced a concept called a representative agent. So different from the registered agent, which is MIDAO, but the representative agent is just a person who gives us their contact info and says we are available to be contacted about this DAO, right? And so there's a form for that. It's something that DAOs are required to keep updated. Is who's that contact person that the government and MIDAO can get in touch with. Another nice thing about the regulation that maybe applies less directly to our clients, but we've introduced process improvements on the government side so that registrations will happen faster. And we're currently in the middle of implementing these changes. And so the benefits might not be seen for another month or two, at least the greatest benefits. But for example, the whole registration process on the government side used to be very manual. There was a lot of literally printed documents, right? Bring 3 copies of this document to this office, and this office brings one of them to this other office and one to this other office, right? And we were always, driving around and trying to make sure the documents were going to the right place. Well, now the whole process is taking place digitally. Same thing for payments, right? We on behalf of the DAO, we would go to collect a payslip, bring the payslip to another office, pay the payslip, get a receipt, bring the receipt back in triplicate to the other office. And now we're going to have all digital payments, just, normal credit cards and stuff and checks or, the e-checks within the next couple of months. So there's that improvement. Something else that goes in the regulation is a list of sanctions for violations. So previously there was some confusion as to, well, what happens if you don't report all of your beneficial owners accurately? What happens if you don't take a step that's required by the regulation or the law? Well, now it's very clear in the regulation, the fines are reasonable compared to fines that are levied on other companies in other places, and they're specific and you know what to expect. So those are some examples, and maybe Leo, if there's anything top of mind for you or anything else you want me to dig into, you can let me know.
Yeah, I think that's a great overview, and I think it was cool how you touched on some of the behind the scenes that goes on in the Marshall Islands, and how much time we spend working on these applications for each of our DAO LLCs. I think oftentimes I talk to customers who think everything's digitized, but we are working to get there, and we are working to make the process faster. And I'm excited to see how fast we can start pushing through these DAO LLCs in conjunction with the government. But one thing I really did want to zoom in on, Adam, is the registration process. So specifically, if I'm a new DAO LLC, what has changed now? What do I need to be aware of when I'm signing up and want to begin the registration process with MIDAO? And I think you touched a little bit on it with the KYC and the representative agent form, but there are two new forms, the beneficial owner information report, and the certificate of formation has been updated. And I'd kind of like you to touch on that, and what it means for future clients, and how ultimately I think it will make the future onboarding process easier for some of these clients.
Yeah, sounds good. And it probably sounds like a lot when I go over it live. We have luckily a portal that Leo has built where that walks people through the whole process step by step. So once someone does sign up, the whole thing I think can feel a little bit more straightforward. But just to go through that in a little bit of detail. So a couple things that are we don't give examples in the regulation, but MIDAO provides template documents for, is that every DAO needs a certificate of formation and an operating agreement. And the certificate of formation is just this one-page template document that states some basic information about the company, its registered agent, its principal, office address, which we provide in the Marshall Islands, although they can choose something else if they want. And one of the new things we've introduced in this regulation is that the certificate of formation has to include a list of all of the smart contracts owned or leveraged by the DAO in certain ways. So if you have a treasury on chain, that has to be listed. If you have a governance smart contract, if you have a token that tracks your membership, those things have to be listed in the certificate of formation. And this goes back to the concept that, we need to know how to observe the DAO. Right. And this is, again, the trade-off. In exchange for having almost complete anonymity for most of your membership, we just have to be able to look at those smart contracts and follow the money and make sure that, there's nothing bad happening. And so that goes in the certificate of formation now for new DAOs. And the operating agreement, which we also have a new template for. So anyone who's worked with us before has seen our template operating agreements. It's one of the valuable parts of the registration process that we provide. Now we have one giant template that replaces all of the old templates and really walks you through all of the step by step. Here's what the operating agreement means. Okay, at this next step, if you're creating a nonprofit DAO LLC, you need to do the following. If you're creating a for-profit DAO LLC, you need to do this instead. If you're using a token to track your membership, use the following paragraph and modify it. If you're not using a token or using a multi-sig, use the following paragraph. And just throughout, it goes through and talks about here's language you might want to include in your operating agreement. Now, maybe I should have started by saying the operating agreement is the document that defines how your legal entity works and therefore how it connects to any activity that's taking place on chain. So a traditional operating agreement, and people may be more familiar with the term bylaws, which is usually used in the case of corporations or foundations. The operating agreement is the same thing, but for any kind of LLC, including a DAO LLC. And a traditional LLC has an operating agreement that probably says the list of our members is included on Exhibit A. And then you list the names and addresses of all your members. Well, with a DAO LLC, what you can do instead is you say the members are tracked using the token on this blockchain at this address. And by holding a token, someone is a member. By acquiring a token, they become a member. By no longer holding a token, they're no longer a member, right? And now you've taken that same corporate form that everyone in the world is fairly familiar with and just made a small change, which is instead of listing the members on Exhibit A, you're listing the members in a smart contract on the blockchain. And so throughout, there's opportunities to, you can do the same thing with governance. Rather than saying decisions shall be made in a meeting and the meeting shall be called at least 7 days in advance and shall take place either online or at our office, and or a decision can be made in lieu of a meeting by email if the following conditions are met, right? Those are the kinds of things you'd find in a traditional bylaws or operating agreement. Now with the DAO LLC, you can say, decisions are made by following the process contained in the governance smart contract on this blockchain at this address. Or you can reference Snapshot if you use Snapshot, right? Or any kind of cryptographic governance protocol. So that operating agreement is really important. The new template, I think, really helps people think through what they might want to put in there. I should remind people, MIDAO, we're not lawyers, and nothing that we provide is legal advice. Now, we've worked with leading lawyers from around the world, including someone many of you are probably familiar with, Tatiana Cerullo, who's a leading Marshall Islands DAO lawyer, has especially helped us with a lot of our work, including this template. But there's input from lawyers all over the world, but every case is different, right? And that's why it's important to hire a lawyer if you can't afford one, or if there's anything complicated about figuring out your operating agreement. So disclaimer aside, so you've got your certificate of formation and your operating agreement. Now, the next thing is these other forms. So there's something called the Foreign Investment Business License, which is required of all DAOs. It's a old-fashioned concept in Marshall Islands law that we've carried over to the world of DAOs. But now, for the first time, DAOs have their own form and their own set of requirements for the Foreign Investment Business License. We call it the FIBL for short. And so you can see that form in the new regulation. And part of that form says, also, please attach your beneficial owner information report, or BOIR. The BOIR form, which you can also find towards the end of the regulation, that's the form that captures the people who are effectively, quote unquote, doing KYC, right? That's the form where we put all that, the applicant puts information about those beneficial owners or other people that need to be listed. And then that information gets verified by us using a third-party KYC tool, and by the government through their own research. So am I forgetting anything, Leo, or are those the 4 documents that people have to submit during their registration?
Yep. I think you touched on everything there. And I think also an important part is the reason that we're so excited about the operating agreement and certificate of formation, having those smart contracts listed, is it kind of goes back to the origin story that you talked about, right? Where you're trying to mirror what you're doing on chain with what you're doing off chain, right? And when you establish your legal entity. And so the ability to recognize something in your DAO, also in your legal entity, is really unique, and is kind of what gets me excited and us excited about our legal entity and the Marshall Islands DAO LLC. But I think there's another part of it, Adam, where you can also create a fairly simple DAO LLC, and maybe you don't want to reference things on chain, and that's also possible. And I think maybe not a lot of our clients know that, or some of our clients think that you need to be a DAO to set up a DAO LLC, and that's not the case. Some of our clients look very similar to a traditional LLC. But did you have any thoughts on that point, and maybe want to clarify anything there as well?
Yeah, it's a good point. So look, first of all, the DAO LLC is an LLC. Right. It's governed by the LLC laws of the Marshall Islands, except where they're in conflict with the DAO LLC laws. And that's really beneficial, because that way you can go anywhere in the world and everyone can recognize, oh, I'm looking at an LLC, and it is an LLC. The difference is that you put a couple of sentences in your certificate of formation and your operating agreement that basically say this is a DAO LLC, not a regular LLC, in different words. And that makes you subject to the new DAO Act law that we've written as amended, as well as the new regulation, which gives you new capabilities. And so, for example, a regular LLC does have to have managing members. A DAO LLC does not. A regular LLC has to know the names and addresses of all of its members. A DAO LLC does not. And so you're kind of getting the benefit of being an LLC, but also getting the benefit of all of the laws and regulations that we've written that allow you to truly wrap your DAO. So yeah, to your point, going back to the origin story of MIDAO, we want to allow a DAO or anyone, right, who can get the benefits from these, kind of unique treatment to, or even if you don't want to use the benefits today, but maybe you like the idea of potentially using them in the future, right? Or maybe there's a tax benefit to using this entity, right? Maybe you're just 5 people, right, making investments together, and you need a legal entity that's going to allow you to do some activity on chain rather than off chain. Or you want to be in a jurisdiction that is friendly to Web3 and crypto in general. Right? Maybe it has nothing to do with your corporate structure. Maybe you want access to the Marshall Islands regulatory environment where you're allowed to have a governance token. You can have a security token if you want to. You can do almost anything you want with tokens, aside from there's some things that are still restricted, which is you can't be basically a bank or a centralized exchange and be a DAO LLC or any kind of legal entity in the Marshall Islands. You can be any kind. You can create a decentralized protocol of any kind that does DeFi and other types of finance, but you cannot, be a centralized financial service provider. And so there could be a lot of situations where you want to get access to that environment, and maybe you want to structure like a regular LLC, but you want access to that environment. So I think we're still learning all the ways that people are going to want to use the DAO LLC. But to your point, you don't have to be a DAO in the traditional sense of the word. In fact, I think one of the interesting things about the term DAO is that people still disagree on what it means. And usually they're not using it as a legal term, right? They're referring to this new type of often community-oriented organization, often nonprofit, often governing a protocol, but not always doing any of those things. And so, for example, you could run your organization like a traditional corporation if you want to, have a CEO, have a management team, have all the policies, have HR, right? To just look totally like a normal company. Maybe you still want to create a DAO LLC, whether you think of yourself as a DAO or not, right? So yeah, to your point, there is a lot of flexibility in terms of, how you want to use this entity. And I do think, look, if someone says, well, I don't like the term DAO, like, that's okay. I mean, it has to go in your legal documents only. If you want to form a DAO LLC, it's kind of like being like a corporation. You might not like the word corporation, but if that's the right legal form for you, that's the right legal form for you. And you don't have to use the word corporation, right? You could just call yourself Microsoft and not Microsoft Corporation.
Yeah, the goal is one day that everyone will be using a DAO LLC, whether they're involved in crypto or not. And hopefully that happens sooner rather than later. But yeah,
I wouldn't say that, Leo. I think there's a really good use case for lots of legal entities all over, and there's also reasons why you might pick one jurisdiction over another. So the Marshall Islands is going to be the right place for a lot of projects, but not all. DAO LLCs are going to be the right fit for some projects, but not all. So it's not the goal that everyone's going to use a DAO LLC. It's just a goal that it's made available to, the people that are in the circumstances where it's the right fit.
Gotcha. Not the goal, but it wouldn't be bad for business, would it?
That's true.
Awesome. So yeah, I think we touched on, I mean, I can provide a quick summary, but I think we touched on the registration process, and we will link the regulation in the show notes so people can review it. And like Adam mentioned, we have the arrows. We have like an onboarding portal, right? And it's really simple once you start the registration process to see in what order do I need to complete these steps, what forms do I need to fill out. And so while it may be overwhelming when you're listening to us talk about it, once it's in front of you, it's pretty simple and fairly easy to operate. So I think we should also touch on current customers, right? Hopefully some current customers are listening to this podcast or live stream. What do they need to know about the regulation? How does that impact them, Adam?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit less, because a lot of the regulation has to do with the application process. But the difference is there is an annual filing that DAOs need to complete. And this regulation includes that new annual filing form. And so if people want to know what you're going to have to fill out and submit in January, because we do all of our annual filings and annual fees in January in the Marshall Islands, you can go look at the regulation and look at that annual filing form. And one thing you'll see is that you have to attach the beneficial owner information report, or the BOIR, to your annual filing form. And so it's the same KYC requirements now that apply to new applicants, apply to existing DAO LLCs, even if it was different before. So by the way, generally, these requirements are a little bit less stringent than what existed before. So for example, for many of our DAO LLCs, and by the way, these requirements had changed over time because it wasn't clear from the law exactly who should have to do KYC. And so at certain points in time, and I'm not even just talking about the DAO Act, but it turned out when you combine the DAO Act, the LLC Act, the Business Corporations Act, the Banking Acts, other regulations that have been passed in the Marshall Islands, there was room for a lot of subjectivity around, well, who should have to do KYC? So at times, all 25% plus voting rights holders and all managers, if there were any managers, had to do KYC. Now it's just beneficial owners, 25% plus, or if there are none, then all managers have to do it. we always had the minimum of one person when no one fell into either of those two categories. But I think that's the key for existing DAO LLCs is to, now you can see what you're going to have to fill out in January. And it's not going to change until, the next law or regulation gets passed. So you can have some consistency and knowing what to expect.
Yeah, so like at a high level, we're trying to simplify things for our current clients and our future clients. We're trying to create an objective standard for everyone to follow, which I think is now in place. So we're not having to reference different laws and we're unsure about things. And lastly, we're just expediting things. I mean, we talked about the technology improvements with the government earlier, but I think the three things that we're focusing on are simplification, objectivity, and then expediting the process in general. So I'm excited to see where this goes in the future. And yeah, I think we touched on everything with the process, Adam. Is there anything I might be missing?
It's a good question. I mean, I would just say that, every situation is still different. What I'd recommend is folks review the regulation, read the regulation. If you have, especially if you're a lawyer that deals with these DAO LLCs, read the regulation. Let us know if you have any questions, and just also remember that MIDAO is always here to help people through the process. So as you're going through your onboarding portal, you can always reach out and ask questions about how to fill out a certain form or whether something meets a certain requirement, and we can help people out with that.
Awesome. So yeah, I think we covered the regulation pretty in depth, and I think I'd like to just talk a little bit about some use cases we published on our website on our blog section. You can find that at www.midao.org/blog. But the first one I'll talk about is Pith, and I think it's one of the most common use cases we see for our clients, and that is the protocol DAO. And Adam can help me out if he wants, but I often talk to a lot of DAOs, and we talked about this a little earlier in the live stream, where they have a decentralized protocol. In this case, Pith is an oracle, and basically they are trying to operate the protocol or govern the protocol with the DAO. And the reality is that a lot of these protocols, whether they be a DEX, an oracle, some sort of decentralized app on any blockchain, doesn't need to be incorporated because they really exist as a set of smart contracts. But what does need to be incorporated, and in this case, what Pith did, is they incorporated their DAO, which governed the protocol. And so I think with our new regulation and the precedent that Pith and other DAOs have set with us, I think the protocol DAO emerges as one of our best use cases, and becomes a really good example for clients going forward in the future. And if you think you resemble Pith, or if you're excited about what Pith is doing, and you are a client or you are a lawyer that's working with these type of clients, I encourage you to read the blog, as it's really in depth, and it really does a good job of explaining how Pith used us. And I just remind you that now that we have this new regulation, hopefully it will be even easier for these new DAO LLCs to incorporate and get through the process faster and in a simpler way. Adam, I think you wanted to talk about another one of our clients as well.
Yeah, so and Pith, by the way, is I think the leading, if not one of the leading oracles on Solana, if anyone doesn't know. And I think one of the cool things about the DAO LLC legal entity is that it can be used for a variety of purposes. So in the Pith case, the DAO is governing a protocol. Let's also talk about MoonDAO, another popular DAO that people may have heard of. So MoonDAO's mission, if I'm remembering correctly or precisely, is to help colonize the moon, and do so in a way that's not controlled only by giant private companies and governments, right? But done in a more fair, distributed, decentralized way. On the way to colonizing the moon, since that's still something that's in progress, or maybe a little ways away, they've been sending people into space. and creating this amazing community of people that are interested in space travel, in the moon, in colonizing space, starting to build the infrastructure that will be required to eventually do something as massive as colonizing the moon. So this is not an on-chain protocol. Now, they do a lot of cool stuff on-chain. There's all kinds of interesting on-chain stuff they're doing, like a lot of DAOs, but they're not governing a protocol. This is a project that could just as easily, well, not just as easily, but could have chosen to operate as a traditional nonprofit company. Right? You could have formed it could have been a cooperative, could have been a charity, could have been just a community, right? They didn't have to be a DAO because, they're not governing anything on chain per se, but they're leveraging the DAO structure because it's a more compelling way of engaging people, of raising money for a cause, of coordinating around a massive shared mission. And so that's why I like to use it as an example, because they're not governing an on-chain protocol. They're governing the colonization of the moon in the long run and everything that has to take place in the meantime.
That's a pretty cool dichotomy. You have an oracle that's working with large-scale financial institutions, and then you have a DAO LLC that's trying to colonize the moon. And so you have a complete different use cases, but equally awesome and equally cool. And I think the third one that I'll talk about is probably the most out there from an organizational standpoint. It's using something we call futarchy, which is basically a organization, or in this case, a DAO that's completely governed by markets. And it's just as confusing as it sounds. So I encourage you to check them out. They're called MIDAO. And they're probably, in my estimation, or my perspective, the most decentralized, autonomous DAO that we've incorporated. And I know all DAOs are decentralized or autonomous, or as Adam mentioned earlier, people can't even agree what the word means. But in the traditional sense of the word, MetaDAO is really as close as you can get to the ideal standard of a DAO. And they found our DAO LLC to be a really good solution for them, as they were able to do things like mention their governance smart contract in their operating agreement, or mention their governance token in their operating agreement, and define membership in that decentralized manner. And so MetaDAO is probably the DAO I'm most excited about today. I encourage everyone to check out all of these DAOs. They're all doing really, really cool things, and they're all using a DAO LLC. And the last reminder is, if you want to check it out, any of these DAOs out, or do more research, they're all available as blogs. We have customer spotlights of all of them as blogs on our website at www.
Yeah, and let me also just touch on the MetaDAO case, because I think what it highlights, what all these cases in conjunction highlight, is you can do almost anything you can imagine with a DAO LLC in terms of how your DAO is organized and structured, its business purpose, et cetera. And you're really limited only by what you can put in code or in English, which is anything, right? It's, again, as long as you don't go against like the specific things that are not allowed, right? And if you're, we could talk about, again, like centralized exchanges and banks one day may be actually licensable in the Marshall Islands. But in terms of your governance structure, right, you could create, even like Leo's describing, a market that ends up leading to governance decisions that are enforceable and valid for your company, for your DAO LLC, for your legal entity, right? Such that if you end up in court, or if some other organization or a member wants to know, hey, what was the official corporate decision on this matter, right? In a traditional corporation, you got to ask the CEO. And if the CEO can't decide, you got to ask the board. In futarchy, with a DAO LLC, you look at the result of the market mechanism. That is the company's decision. That is the final enforceable legal decision. And so that's really never been possible before. And I mean, I'll also compare it to, it reminds me of, like, we often compare it to the foundation structure, right? In a foundation, because a lot of DAOs still use foundations, right? We still see a lot of people doing that. A lot of projects use foundations. In a foundation, a board is in charge. Right. And sometimes you say, well, okay, well, we're going to have the board sign a contract saying that most of the time they're going to act in accordance with the wishes of the token holders. Or if it's a futarchy, you could say with the wishes of the market outcome. But that person or persons on the board always has the right to decide, well, it would be illegal for me to take this action that the DAO voted on. or unethical for me to take this decision, or for some reason we're deciding, this is the extreme case, but we're deciding that we're going to go, we're going to shut down the DAO and give the money back to ourselves, right? And because this is like the worst case scenario that happens sometimes. I'm not going to name names right now, but and it leads to all kinds of conflict and lawsuits and stuff. But if you want to avoid that extra step, which makes things less autonomous, right? It's really the step of like, okay, we make a decision through whatever mechanism, and now the board decides, right? Versus in a DAO LLC, you can have that structure if you want. You can use managers and give them those rights, but usually they don't. In a DAO LLC, normally, whatever your governance mechanism, which is anything you can put in code or write in English in your operating agreement or reference in a smart contract, is the enforceable legal decision of your organization. And so whether that is, you want that because you want full direct democracy or something in between a traditional corporate governance and direct democracy, or you want futarchy or whatever, that's all possible with the DAO LLC.
Yeah, and I think just another crazy thing that blows my mind is that futarchy was a theoretical concept proposed by Robin Hanson that had never been implemented effectively. And the person and the people who created the DAO wanted to implement futarchy for the first time. And they thought that the DAO was the best way to do so. So if you're not bullish on DAOs and you're not a believer, I think that the MIDAO example is a great way to kind of conjure some belief in DAOs, because people had tried to use this futarchy model, this theoretical model before, and the DAO was the only thing that allowed them to do so. And so I think DAOs are here to stay, and that DAO specifically always gets me so excited, and I love talking about them because I think they're doing some really cool things. Any other thoughts, Adam? Anything you wanted to talk about before we kind of wrap things up about anything that we touched on?
I'll just add a quick note, which is I'm going to be at DAO Tokyo and Fairness 2024 in Tokyo and at ETH Tokyo all next week. So if anyone's that is the week of August 19th. So if anyone's listening to this before then and happens to be in Japan or is going to be there for the same events, please let me know so we can meet up. But no, Leo, I think this has been great. Thank you.
Awesome. As a reminder, if you're interested in reaching out, please do. We have a huge a lawyer network that you can talk to. And I know this whole episode has kind of been like an ad for MIDAO, but we really do want to help you. So if you're a lawyer or if you're a DAO looking to get set up, please do reach out to us. We can add you to our lawyer network that we're working on, and we can put you in contact with whether you're a lawyer, we can put you in contact with a potential client, or if you're a DAO, we can put you in contact with lawyers that can help you out. Lastly, you can find us on Farcaster at MIDAO. You can find me on Twitter and Farcaster at Leo Henkels. Always check out our Twitter for MIDAOs at MIDAOs, MIDAODS. And then Adam, did you want to show some of your socials as well?
Yeah, find me on Farcaster at The Thriller, or Twitter is 0xThriller because The Thriller wasn't available. And happy to chat with anyone who wants to talk about DAOs. Awesome.
We're always here to help, so please do reach out if you want to talk. If you would consider liking the podcast or leaving us a comment, we'd love to. We love our fans, and we'd love to hear from you guys. And as a disclaimer and a reminder, none of this was legal, financial, or tax advice. Please consult the respective professionals for that type of advice. We're not your lawyer, we're not your tax advisor, etc. So if you have any of those questions, we can point you to people who can answer them, but we can't answer them ourselves. Lastly, are you thinking about starting a DAO? Just DAO it.